This is Duke University.
Welcome to the Samford School of Public Policy. I'm Fritz Mayer. I'm a professor here of public policy, political science, and environment. I'm also Associate Dean here for Strategy and Innovation. It's an interesting title. This is a tremendously exciting occasion for us tonight. Opportunity to host the 2014 von der Heyden lecture, which will be delivered, as you know, by Pascal Lamy, the former Director General of the WTO. Let me start by thanking a number of people and organizations. So first to Carl and Mary Ellen von der Heyden, who gave the funds for this lecture. The Center for International Studies at Duke was very generous in their support. The Provost's office, so particularly the previous provost, Peter Lang, who was very generous in his support. The Samford School of Public Policy, and the Center for Globalization, Governance, and Competitiveness, all of whom are co-sponsoring the event tonight. I'm speaking here tonight sort of with both of my hats. First as a dean here at the Samford School. This is just the kind of event we are really trying to sponsor, that is to say, engagement with policymakers. Not only is Mr. Lamy speaking tonight, but this is the keynote address for what we've called the Duke Global Summit on Governance and Development in a Value Chain World. And a number of us have been engaged through the day and will be again tomorrow talking to each other. The people we've brought together are about, I think, 18 or 20 practitioners from international organizations, quite high-level officials. And we're joined by some of the leading academics who are thinking about these subjects as well. And it's just a terrific example of the kind of engagement that we here at Samford are trying to promote. I know I always learn, if I dare say, more from talking to practitioners sometimes than from my fellow academics. So it's a wonderful occasion for us. My other hat is as a professor and researcher. This is my subject area, and so I've been fortunate to co-chair this summit with my colleague Gary Jeffrey, with whom I'll introduce in a moment. This is the topic of Pascal Lamy's address tonight and of the summit more generally is a terrifically important topic. It's beginning perhaps 30 years ago, we saw a real change in the international economy, often called globalization, but a fundamental aspect of that change was a new way of doing economic, or new form of economic organization or economic activity, in which activities that were once bundled together in firms began to be outsourced to different actors around the globe often, sometimes in what were called supply chains. This phenomenon of breaking apart the production process into various tasks was a real change in the way in which the economy was organized. And it took a while for academics to begin to recognize that this was happening and to think about it. And so a group of academics, many of them here tonight, including my colleague Gary Jeffrey, were instrumental in beginning to think about this phenomenon and try to understand the drivers behind it and to give a name to it. Supply chains, commodity chains, ultimately what became known as global value chains. For our purposes here at the Samford School, this phenomenon of global value chains turns out to have really important policy implications. And it's taken a bit of time for policymakers to begin to recognize that, but one piece of evidence of that is the incredible representation of international organizations and national governments and some advocacy organizations as well who are assembled here at Duke at the moment to think about the policy implications of this new global value chain world. Why are we doing this at Duke? Well, it's important, and we like to pick important topics. but the short answer of why we're doing it at Duke is Gary Gireffi. Gary was one of the first academics to begin to recognize the significance of this change in the world economy, one of the first to conceptualize it, one of the real leaders in academia. There are others here with us tonight, but I dare say his biggest impact has been in engaging with the world of policymakers, of pushing this idea out into the world, of proselytizing for its importance. I remember talking to Gary about this probably more than 20 years ago now, and he would talk to anyone who would listen about the importance of value chains and global value chains. I didn't know what he was talking about at the time. But Gary is a persistent man, and he 10 years ago founded a center here that I alluded to before, the Center on Globalization, Governance, and Competitiveness, that's become really the leading center probably in the world, doing applied analysis on global value chains. And now everyone's talking about GVCs, and that has happened, and that Pascal Lamy is here with us tonight is in no small measure a testament to Gary's prescience about the importance of these things and to his persistence. So it's altogether fitting that Gary should introduce our speaker this evening. So I give you a professor of sociology and director of the Center for Globalization, Governance, and Competitiveness, Gary Gireffi.
Also, good evening and welcome to the von der Heyden lecture. And thanks to Fritz for that very kind introduction. But I do think that this is a great occasion, not only because we have a chance to hear from Pascal Lamy, who is one of the foremost thinkers on international trade, but also because this lecture is part of this bigger Duke Global Summit where we're bringing together a number of international organizations and academics who have been working on these issues. So I think, as Fritz said, this is creating the kind of dialogue we want to be part of at Duke University. And I think this is a fantastic tribute, and this keynote will be extremely important to mark what this event is all about. So Pascal Lamy has been called the central figure in international trade policy over the last quarter century, and I think it's a very well-deserved title. Mr. Lamy had a very distinguished career in French civil service in the 1980s and 1990s, serving in high positions of the Ministry of Economics and Finance, and also with the Prime Minister's office as deputy head of Prime Minister Mulroy's cabinet. But for our purposes, one of the reasons why he is so important is the role that he's played in international trade policy. Pascal Lamy was the European Union Trade Commissioner from 1999 to 2004, and then he served a 2-year term as Director General of the World Trade Organization, where I think his impact became truly global. So Pascal Lamy served as Director General of WTO from 2005 to 2013. In this position, I think he's really been on the front lines of the relationship between trade and development. And I think that connection between trade and development wasn't always a given in terms of the role of the WTO. There was a period when the WTO was largely focusing on trade rules and helping people, the trade negotiators, have the information that they needed. But as we moved into the 2000s and the full impact of economic globalization started to become apparent, I think the role of the WTO started to change in some very profound ways, not least of which is the impact of the 2008-2009 economic recession and how the WTO, along with some of the other key international organizations, had to try to figure out what their role should be in this evolving global economy. Pascal has written many articles and books while he was Director General of WTO. In one of his articles, he really started to highlight the importance of what, in our context, we're calling global value chains. in terms of global commerce. And one of his articles says that global value chains have represented an unprecedented level of interdependency among countries engaged in global supply chains. It is no longer just about exports. Imports are essential to exports. It's no longer just about them, it's about us. And I think this transformation in the world of trade, where you had to start to see imports as essential to exports, is part of what some people have called this global value chains revolution. And I think Pascal Lamy has been coining the terms of the old world of trade and the new world of trade, and I think tonight we're going to be hearing more about his vision of that distinction, and in particular, the new role of trade. In terms of highlighting the importance of these global supply chains, global value chains, Pascal Lamy at the WTO launched something called the Made in the World Initiative around 2009. It became very highly publicized through a number of websites, and I think it sparked a series of high-level conferences calling for major change in how international trade statistics would be collected and analyzed. And we just had a great panel as part of the Duke Global Summit, bringing together a number of the organizations that are part of this reanalysis of international trade statistics. One of the outcomes was WTO and OECD together created a new database called Trade and Value Added, and that's becoming a very important part of the tools that international policymakers are starting to use in managing the global economy. Just before he left office in September 2013, WTO held a big international conference in Geneva together with OECD called Aid for Trade, Connecting to Value Chains. And a number of the people that are here at this Duke Global Summit were part of that. And I think it was a very fitting kind of a capstone event for the importance that he's been giving to this new world of trade, and in particular, global value chains in our terms. Since he's left the Director Generalship of the WTO, he hasn't been resting very much. He's published 2 books. One of the more recent ones is talking about the Geneva Consensus. And this week, I've noticed he's got a very influential editorial in the Financial Times that's talking about the TTIP negotiations, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, and comparing that with the earlier sort of 20th century type of trade negotiations. And it's predictably causing a lot of reaction, because if the former Director General of the WTO enters into any of these topics, it's going to get a lot of attention. And him being at Duke gives us a chance to hear his ideas firsthand and to learn what this new world of trade is from Pascal Lamy's perspective. So we're going to hear the keynote address, which is called Global Value Chains and the New World of Trade. So I hope you'll help me in welcoming Pascal Lamy as the von der Heyden Lecturer for Duke University this year.
Well, good evening. Let me first thank Fritz and Gary for their introduction. Thank the Stanford School of Public Policy for organizing this event. And thank the organizers for what has been so far, I think, an extremely active, interesting discussion in this Duke Global Summit on Value Chains. I think both of you have succeeded in gathering, convening the cream of world knowledge on global value chains, and I think this deserves a bit of congratulation and celebration. The most frequent observations I've heard during the sort of 15 years or so of my life I spent alongside this issue of global value chains goes like this. global value chains are not new, but they nevertheless change lots of things about trade. Now, is this a paradox that something that's not new can change many things? In some way, yes, although if value chains are not new to economic life, what is new is the global value chain, and probably also the speed of the expansion of these value chains. Now, my intention tonight is not to describe this phenomenon. I think others have done it and probably would do it better than I would, but rather to underscore what this phenomenon changes. And I'll try to do this in, standing on two legs, the one of the practitioner in the dirty, greasy, smelling machine room of trade, and the one of the academic up there on the deck, which is clean, windy, and where clear binoculars help you scrutinizing the horizon. And looking at these two aspects, I think what global value change, according to me, is in three major, although different areas. Global value chains change the way we understand trade. Global value chains change the way we conduct trade. And global value chains change the way we govern trade. Now, starting with the first point, how does this expansion of global supply chain change the way we understand trade? In a nutshell, it takes us back to what is essential, which is not trade, which after all is a transmission belt, but production systems. And global value chains change the way we analyze and the way we measure trade through these new lenses. In terms of analyzing trade, global value chains take us back to a reality which all practitioners know, but which unfortunately the scenery of trade negotiation often obscures, which is simply that nations do not trade. Firms trade. And it takes us to this consideration that while we talk about international trade, i.e. trade in between nations, we use a sort of confusing semantic. Suffice to look at the supply chain of Boeing or Airbus. For public opinion in general, Boeing is US made and Airbus is EU made. So there's a trade between these. I mean, we all know if we look at the decomposition of the supply chain that this makes absolutely no sense. So global value chains have the big advantage of grounding us into reality, leaving this confusing scenery. They, of course, have the big advantage as looking at trade as the various links between not nations, but stages of productions of goods and services across an increasingly large and expanding geographically chain. That's what I called, when I was WTO DG, Made in the World, to find a sort of logo that would help people understanding. Gary, who mentioned this, didn't say that at the time it didn't make me many friends in many places. It was, and I knew that when we invented this, and Patrick Lowe, who's here, will probably remember, it was a sort of provocation. And many people reacted in a sort of very negative way, although you sometimes have, to call a spade for people to change the way they look at things. Global value chains help us understanding that frontiers are blurred in the economic integration of today. Looking at domestic supply chains, regional supply chains, global supply chains, trying to find any sort of clear distinction between these three categories is simply impossible. Not least because these global supply chains are often connected with regional supply chains, which are themselves connected with domestic supply chains. We heard today about sectors like packaging or fertilizers who cross across many of these production processes. And by the way, this is also true in services, although it's a bit more difficult to conceptualize. Global value chains help us understanding how trade works because they help us mapping the role of firms along these chains. Lead firms, buyers, suppliers, pure traders, who sometimes are an important link in the value chain, retailers at one bit, sourcers at the other bit. All this game about who has authority and power on revenue, distribution, profit, is much more visible when you use the global value chain approach than the classical trade approach. And it helps us a lot, and unsurprisingly, we've heard quite a bit of that today, and probably a bit more tomorrow. It helps us focusing much more precisely on this linkage between trade and development. Notably, if you start looking at where exactly the value is created along the chain, by whom, and what's the final distribution of this value which is created between, to put it very simply, revenues on the one side, which basically are wages, and profit on the other side. Hence, a much more powerful instrument to understand why and how trade can work or not work for poverty reduction. Now, we all know trade works for growth. No doubt about this. We're not always sure that this growth, which is trade created, works for poverty reduction. Looking at the various stages of the value addition helps us a lot, giving an answer to these questions, which of course remains a major one. And this is where we had to change the way we measure trade. And there's no way we can fully understand what's going on without changing the way we measure trade. These global value chains have obliged us to adopt the new way of looking at trade, which is basically switching from the old approach, which was volumes, to the new approach, which is measuring trade in value addition, for a simple reason, which is that as global trade expands, numbering trade in volumes make less and less sense. In the old world of trade, a car was produced in a country for 100 and exported to another country for 100. You had 100 trade. In the new world of trade, assume the car is produced in 5 different countries, who each of them add 20% of the total value of the car. What you will register in the volume of world trade is 300. 20 plus 40 plus 60 plus 80 plus. You still have a car which is worth 100, which is what was created, but you have 3 times more volume of international trade. Now, this makes no sense, especially if you use model, which I must say economists still use, where you use a ratio which is volumes on the numerator and GNP on the denominator. And you draw policy consequences from these calculations. So that's what led to this issue of, which was already mentioned by Gary, of measuring trade in value addition, which is an initiative I launched in 2008-09. Building, by the way, as we say in France, il faut rendre à César ce qui appartient à César, building on work which has been done in the 80s by JETRO, which is the research institute of the MITI in Japan, who was the first research which really entered into this sort of measure. And let me use the occasion of the presence of so many luminaries of global value chain in this room to thank most of you wholeheartedly for the way you all engaged in this process, which could only be cooperative and which, I must say, and I've already said that publicly, so I'm not saying this to be nice to you, which is something that worked incredibly faster than I would have even imagined when I launched that. In my mind, in 2008-09, when I took this initiative, my view was it would take 10, 15 years before we get to a first acceptable, statistically reasonably good sample of input-output databases, the input-output tables, which is what you need to calculate trade in value addition, because the input-output table structure is different from the one you use in your domestic system. It took not even 5 years to get there. And that's thanks to basically the sort of enthusiasm which many of you showed. So thanks for that. And of course, more to do, because what we issued in April 2013 with the OECD was a sort of first batch, which is now work in progress. But that's something that's a major development, which we owe to global value chains, which, as I said, necessitated a different way of counting, and which then will help us, if these input-output tables are sufficiently decomposed, refined, more countries, more sectors, more disaggregation within sectors, to understand in a much more granular way how value addition and at which stage and in which place it is created. And this probably will have sort of unintended consequences on issues like, for instance, the sort of harmonization in the way tax authorities have to look at transfer prices. Now, that was not the intention, but if you look at the problems they sometimes have, I don't say we anymore, in comparing micro data on value addition chains and macro data on value addition chains, there are discrepancies which appear and which stems from the fact that multinational corporations, who are the sort of few thousand companies on this planet who are in this game, of course, use various tax lawyers and devices to locate their value addition at the place where it's the least tax in their P&L, which of course doesn't correspond to what you see in economic reality. So more development of this kind, which I think at the end of the day are welcome. So we probably thanks to this development, now understand more, I think it also changes the way we conduct trade. And let me mention a few aspects of that. First, and we discussed that today, global value chains lower the entry ticket by smaller, poorer producers, because reaching out to the global market, if you only have to do that on a segment, a fragment of the production process, whether goods or services, is less costly than in the past in terms of capital, technology, knowledge, skills, and the rest. Now, we're still looking at firm data to support this experience. And I mean, I still spend quite a lot of time in Africa, for instance. I mean, the results in some cases are absolutely obvious. But this phenomenon, which is, it still needs to be, again, refined, although I believe it's a major contribution to helping a number of countries who otherwise could not exceed the size of the market, which allow them to enter into economies of scale and upgrade their production systems. It also changes the way we conduct trade because it reshuffles the landscape of comparative advantages in many ways, and more rapidly. For instance, with a much bigger emphasis than in the past on areas like logistics, like the efficiency of transport systems, like energy systems, availability of the chain of coal, for instance, in the agro-food value chain becomes essential. If there's a rupture in the whole chain that starts from cropping mangoes to having them on the shelf of Ahold in the Netherlands, it's the whole thing that crumbles, hence much more attention and, in a way, value to these elements than in the past. Not to speak about much simpler issues like border crossing issues. In many countries, you still have quite a lot of red tape, quite a lot of waiting lines for trucks, assuming, by the way, the border posts are open during the same hours of the day, which is not always the case. That's not rocket science, but it sometimes is a big problem for running properly the value chain. More, of course, progress since the Bali Agreement on Trade Facilitation was done at the WTO at the end of last year, and my own sense, for what it's worth, is that this will happen, whatever the skirmishes of politics may be, this will happen, because at the end of the day, it's so obvious that it's good for everybody. Of course, global value chains and their connection with regional value chains also reshape some of the approaches to regional integration. Look at what's happening in ASEAN. Look at what's happening in Central America. Not to talk about Europe and NAFTA. And this, of course, offers new opportunities which weren't there before. Let me give you just one example. Rwanda, which is a country I happen to know a bit because one of my deputies when I was WTO DG was a formidable Rwandan lady, is a small landlocked country. A problem of being small and landlocked. They are now succeeding in judoing with the situation, in branding Rwanda as the hub where you need to be in Eastern Africa, betting on the fact that maybe one day RDC will become a real country, and that the whole integration since Mombasa, Dar es Salaam, through Kenya to Rwanda, and then to Kinshasa will work. That's something that has to do with the concept of value chains, including in applying this to the services industry. It also changes the way we conduct trade because it also transforms the sort of risk appreciation which producers need to have on these production processes. We all know global supply chains are more efficient. We also know that in many cases they are more fragile. They are more vulnerable. Natural or man-made disasters can have, although their probability hasn't changed, the impact, if it happens, is magnified by the existence of global supply chain. Look at what happened during after the Fukushima accident, or what happened after the Rana Plaza terrible catastrophe in Bangladesh. This had huge consequences on the rest of the supply chain because a rupture, for various reasons, happened. If you look at the way global companies, including insurance companies, now look at critical sea routes, they have a map of critical sea routes which is different from the one they had 10 or 15 years ago because of these supply chains. And if I'm in the business of insurance or reinsurance, that can make a big difference on my own P&L. I'll come back later, but I just mentioned there the fact that these global supply chains have created reputational risks. A bit more later on that, but this is something that also matters a lot in the way trade is conducted. And by the way, a proper appreciation of these risks sometimes leads to shrinking the global value chain. So not all supply chains are expanding. Some are shrinking because of what they call near-sourcing, which is that after a proper consideration of the efficiencies you get from local specialization of production processes against the risk, which sometimes increase, then the rational solution sometimes is near sourcing. And nowhere has it been more obvious than in the financial industry, for instance, where during and after the financial crisis, bankers, including in important areas for trade, which is trade finance, retreated in their proximity because this is the ground they know the best. Finally, there's also one aspect on which global value chains change or should change the way trade is conducted, which is exchange rates. Exchange rate action, and let's be fair, there is some exchange rate action by some from time to time, has a totally different consequence whether or not you are in a world of global supply chains. I often quote this number, which is the average import content of exports, which was roughly 20% 20 years ago, which is roughly 40% today, which probably will be 60% 20 years from now. And this is a sort of condensed number of what global supply chains mean. Acting on your exchange rate may provide you with a benefit if the import content of your export is 20%. If it's 60%, not anymore. you're basically shooting in your own foot. And I think this is something that needs to be factored in. And of course, the elasticity of response to an exchange rate, let's say, action, will depend very much on whether or not the country is more or less integrated and whether this average number which I give is upwards or downwards. And this is something that leads to, again, more attention on areas like, for instance, the elasticity of trade to revenues, which have a different bearing. And if you do the calculations for different countries, you come to different conclusions, whether you look at this elasticity in measuring trade in volumes or whether you look at this elasticity in measuring trade in value addition. Now, finally, I think global supply chain also change or should change the way we govern trade. In many ways, global supply chains is or has killed mercantilism. Understood, and Gary mentioned that a moment ago, mercantilism understood sort of simply like exports are good and imports are bad. And we know that there is still quite a bit of that in the mind of many of us, including seasoned trade negotiators. Now, the moment you start understanding properly the reality, which is that you need to import in order to export, your mental machinery changes. And I think it changes in the right direction because this is the reality. I was involved in a bit of a public discussion last year comparing my country's trade numbers with the German trade number. And if you look at that, whether in volumes or, by the way, in value addition, what's pretty clear is that the Germans export much more in proportion of their GNP than my country, but they also import much more than my country. And exposing this publicly raised many eyebrows. I mean, how is it that this guy can export more if they import more? I mean, but that's the reality because this is where value addition happens. So, in this sense, it is a major change in the way trade is governed or regulating, because the more these global supply chains expand, the larger part of the production they are involved in, the less classical obstacle to trade like tariffs makes sense. What I said about exchange rate, I could say about tariffs. If 60% of your exports are imports to which you've added value, shooting on your imports is just shooting on your exports. And it's obviously deteriorating your export competitiveness, which, by the way, is probably on top of the important role of the WTO and the TGWO in coping with the financial crisis in 2008, in putting together this sort of rather strong monitoring mechanism, which is probably one of the explanations why protectionism didn't flare up during this crisis. So I attribute a lot of that, of course, to the existence of disciplines and institutions. But if you look in the detail, in some cases, it just didn't happen because people started understanding that it shouldn't happen because that was bad for them. And I've always thought that, you know, in human communities, good sense is sometimes more efficient than disciplines. I mean, disciplines may be necessary in case good sense is not that widespread. But if it becomes so obvious, then people rationalize their behavior. Now, as these classical obstacles to trade disappear, and they are disappearing, of course, new obstacles to trade appear, and this is this change between tariff measures and non-tariff measures. Although having looked and been at least externally involved in this TTIP negotiation, I think this notion that it's about tariff measures or non-tariff measures is very confusing. Not only, I mean, for a simple reason, which is that if you talk about tariff measures, the purpose of trade opening, trade governance, trade regulation, is to eliminate this sort of obstacle. If you talk about non-tariff measures, there's one big mistake that shouldn't be made, which is giving the impression that opening trade is getting rid of the measures. The name of the game in non-tariff measures is not getting rid of the measures, but it's getting rid of the discrepancies in the measures. And this opened a whole new field, which is this big difference between classical obstacles to trade, which in a way were there before global value chains expanded, the purpose of which was to protect the producer, to this different world where obstacles to trade stem from differences in measures to protect not the producer but the consumer, which is this world of precaution as opposed to the previous world, which was the world of protection. And this is, in a way, what you can see in the present landscape of these so-called mega deals, TPP being in many ways the last big negotiation in the old world, and TTIP being the first of the new negotiations in the new world. Now, please notice that I said negotiations and not agreements. I'm well placed to know, like a number of you, to know that there is quite a difference between launching a negotiation and getting to an agreement under the form of a treaty. Now, true, and I'll just bring there sort of a nuance, the old world is still there and the new world is not yet all there. For instance, and I'm grateful it was mentioned in the discussion today, if you look, for instance, at the way rules of origin still constrain global value chains in asking for a certain level of value addition in which country or that country, that's classical old stuff. And the example was given of India who wants agrees to import textiles from Bangladesh, provided the fabric is Indian and not Chinese. That's typical old world, and it impacts textile, garment, and apparel supply chains in the SAFTA region, no doubt about this. So I'm not saying, the old world is dead and we're all in the new world. Like all these transitions, it takes time. But if we want to adjust the way we govern trade to this new reality, we have to think this way. It also has a major importance, and unsurprisingly, we discussed this yesterday night and today, in the way the role of the state and the role of the firms, the role of the consumers and the role of the regulators impact issues like social and environmental sustainability. Besides the sort of normal approach to multilateral disciplines, regulations, in order to make sure that economic development, the expansion of trade, serve the upgrading of social conditions or the upgrading of environmental friendliness of goods or services, global supply chains have created a new stream, which in the Oxford Martin Commission report I had the privilege to chair and partly write, I now call polylateralism as opposed to multilateralism, which is that there is an obvious role for global supply chains in exerting pressure on the upgrading of social and environmental standards. We know it's happening. Look at Apple Foxconn. We discussed this example, again, unsurprisingly. Look at what happened after the Rana Plaza fire. There are many examples of that. Look at what's starting to happen, at least, if I understand well, in the supply chain of palm oil, following civil society mobilization against deforestation because of palm oil production harming habitats of nice monkeys. This is happening. And in a way, it is a positive contribution because otherwise it probably wouldn't happen given the huge viscosity of the international system and its, let's say, relative incapacity to be good at connecting these values with economic expansion. Now, whether global value chains can be sort of analyzed as a sort of outsourcing in the hands of firms and multinational corporations of what normally should be from public regulation source or not, I'm not sure about this. My own guess, but it's only a guess, is that we will have this phase, we are having this phase, where private standards, who are the ones I have to respect. If I'm an Ethiopian exporter of roses, if Walmart, Carrefour, and Tesco decide that the maximum pesticide residue is more stringent than whatever office of International Office of Plant Health, the public standard, I don't care. I care about who will buy my roses, and it's Tesco, Walmart, and the Carrefour. So we probably are in a phase where the impact of global supply chains gives a much larger prominence to private standards, which politically I see as a problem, although if it goes in what I believe the right direction, I may not be very pleased with the process, but I'm pleased with the result. Now, is this a transition? Which it could be, because at some stage, you know, if I'm Carrefour or Walmart or Tesco, and I have to have one standard here and one standard there and another standard there because the consumer organization in the US says something different from Europe and something different from Japan, and one day something different in Indonesia or even China, I might be in favor of a public standard, because this is what will provide me with a proper level playing field in respecting environmental or social standards. That's an open question. I don't have a sort of definitive answer on this, but we have to watch this. And it may be that for some time these global supply chains will de facto act as a trade governance, producing results which a number of us would have wished the normal multilateral trade governance system to produce. So, time to conclude. In summary, summaries are always risky, but the old world of trade is a world where production was national and obstacle to trade were to protect domestic producers from foreign competition. That's the simple definition of the old world of trade. The new world of trade is a world where production is all over the place, not international, transnational, global, and obstacles to trade are there not anymore to protect the producer, but to protect the consumer. And global value chains are the difference between these two worlds in many ways, and they sometimes are the difference into, and I think what I just said on private standards, into the way the system is governed. Practical, operational side of that, I think I would wish a larger number of trade negotiators to live in the new world, whereas, in my view, they still live in the old world. And on this, I think academic institutions like yours, international organizations who are meant to have a sort of freedom to think, to propose, to put visions on the table, have a big role in bringing the world of trade negotiators into today's and preferably tomorrow's reality of trade and production systems. And I think there is a certain urgency to do that. And when I look at the trouble in which the TTIP is now in, and that was the purpose of my op-ed in the FT on Tuesday, I think that's the problem. This mega negotiation is in danger of failing because it was conceived and sold as if it was the old world. But people realize quite rapidly the difference between the old world and the new world, especially if you're a consumer and you are told, if you are European, that you will have to eat chlorinated poultry. And if you are American, that now American cars will have small bumpers because that's the way Europeans parameter their crash tests. Now, if you don't understand that, you'll have problems with this new world. And to end, and that's what we should do in a school like this one, on something which is a bit more of a philosophical note, looking at these new world, old world, looking at the role of global value chains in this transformation, I cannot not think about Polanyi, who was the one who I think very clearly outlined the dangers of market capitalism as a process which disembeds economic systems and social systems. Maybe, not sure about this, maybe this new world, and maybe global supply chains are one way where the expansion of market capitalism will be constrained to re-embed economic systems and social systems. And if you look at what can happen along the value chain, and I've worked on that quite a long time, including discreetly, for instance, with the International Trade Union Confederation, there are possibilities there which were not there before, but which I think may be good news, provided we use them properly. There may be some of this philosophical and political promise in the phenomenon of global value chains. Thanks for your attention.
Well, thank you, Pascal, for that very thoughtful tour of the horizon of trade in this new world. We have some time for questions and answers. There's a microphone set up in the back, so if you have a question, we want to be sure to capture it. So if you could if you have a question, move to the back and to the microphone that's there. We have about 20 minutes or so, and then I remind you that we have, or you may have noticed when you came in, we have a reception afterwards. So do stay around. We have food and drink afterwards. But, Tim.
Tim Sturgeon, MIT. Thanks, Dr. Lamy. It was a fantastic speech. I have a question. The original kind of paper that triggered a lot of our thinking here was the 2009 paper by Greg Linden, Dedrick, and Ken Kramer, Jason Dedrick, about the kind of decomposing the value added in the iPod. And here we learned, crucially, that the value added of the $189 factory gate price for the iPod, only $3.50 was added in China. So that was kind of a revolution. But the other thing that iPod study showed is about $70 was added in the US. So I just want to ask, is value added the same as value capture? Is that the same concept, or is that something different? The second thing that study showed, and I think there's been a lot less attention here, is that Apple captured at least $50 of that value, and probably more because they had some of the retail markup as well. So that kind of level of trade, and as you said, GVCs are about trade between firms, but I still don't see the firms in the TIVA data set, for example. I just see the stuff moving around. Thank you.
No, I think these are excellent questions which tell us that we have to keep digging and digging and digging and decomposing the numbers on both where the value addition happens and how it is distributed. And what I said on transfer prices came very often to my mind because a lot of these granularity which you are asking for to make up your mind on where it happens needs proper microeconomic data, which I know are, let's say, heavily influenced by tax considerations. Now, I hope we are nearing a stage where these discrepancies will vanish. I think, by the way, it will happen. But I don't think today we have a proper sort of numbered answer to your question. And we need number to answer your question. And it's, I visited this Foxconn factory in Chengdu quite a bit of time ago, at a time where, there were still roughly 150,000 people in the factory, which is a town factory. I'm told, and I'll go there very soon, I'm told that now 1/3 of the Foxconn factory is robots, which will also probably heavily influence the way we calculate this value addition and where it goes and where it comes from. So I don't think I have a sort of precise answer to your question because I don't have the numbers, but I know that in digging in this direction, which numbers in volumes totally obscure, we might have an answer.
I'm Rafi Kaplinsky from the Open University and Sussex University in the UK. I'm a South African, and our former ambassador to the WTO, whom you will know, says that the trade framework which you've mapped out for global value chains is indistinguishable from the neoliberal agenda. Would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, I heard that story. Two simple answers, hoping that there is nobody from the media that will quote me. Yeah. First, coincidentally, this view comes from countries who are little inserted in global supply chains, with one exception, which is South Africa, and I'll come back to that. It's a coincidence. It's like in agriculture, you know, the ones that ask for non-trade concerns to be factored in agriculture a lot are the ones who are the least competitive. So there's, in these trade and economic matters, there is always some sort of alignment of your rational economic interest and the theory you have of how things should go. Now, in the case of South Africa, I'm a bit more puzzled because when I listen to what South Africa says at UNCTAD, I hear what you said. Global supply chains is a new way for multinational corporations to impose a race to the bottom in increasing competition, in localizing, specialization, and the sort of this negative view of competition. I don't have a totally 100% positive view of competition, but not that one. Now, when I listen to the same South African trade minister talking to his colleagues in SADC, it's all about global regional supply chains, in which, of course, South Africa has, let's say, a bigger interest in regional global supply chains working in Africa. So it's a different standard. I think there is a view by some that global supply chains are the new way capitalists have invented to pressure social conditions or environmental standards on the way down. That's not what the numbers I look at say. But I recognize we need more numbers, as for a long time we've needed more numbers to evidence that trade was overall a positive sum game, although under conditions and with redistribution issues, which you have to be very attentive to, which was the purpose of this Geneva consensus, which Gary mentioned. But I mean, these sort of ideological veils, I'm a bit suspicious about. I prefer to look at the numbers, and overall, I think global supply chains have helped a number of developing countries growing their economies, hence offering the possibility, and in sometimes the reality, of an important reduction in poverty, although it's clear that, at least for the moment, this has been going together with an increase in inequalities. But that's, that's the logic of market capitalism. As you may know, I'm not a 100% fan of market capitalism. I think this system has, at least on the political, philosophical, and moral side, a number of drawbacks. I also belong to a generation who knows that so far what has been tried as an alternative has not worked, which doesn't mean that we shouldn't work on an alternative, but with a sense of realism.
Hi, I'm a first-year student of public policy here, and my question is from the perspective of public policy. You mentioned in the beginning that nations do not trade firms do. But at the end of those trade firms, there are people. And you mentioned something about consumer protectionism as a barrier to trade. So I want to understand, as a public policy student and hopefully practitioner in the future, in the absence of numbers that you just spoke about, what are the things that we need to keep in mind that we cannot ignore global value chains?
Yeah. I hope I haven't said consumer protection is an obstacle to trade. Because said this way, no, the reality is that as revenue grow, people, and I'm fine with that, acquire a right which they didn't have if their problem was whether they should feed their kids the next day. They acquire a right to dream. And together with the right to dream goes the right to nightmare, which is why precaution is totally correlated to revenue. So, consumer protection, animal welfare standards, environmental standards, social standards will go up. And I'm fine with that. And in some ways, one can say that consumer protection is an obstacle to trade. If I'm the Ethiopian producer of roses I was mentioning, and my roses do not match the European standard of maximum pesticide residues, I can't sell my roses in Europe. It's an obstacle to trade, as if the tariff was 2,000%. Okay. But presenting the things this way is misleading. What is a real obstacle to trade, because nobody is going to go to his or her parliament to say, for the sake of opening trade, I'm going to relax my pesticide residue standard. Nobody is ever going to do that. I remember when I was European Commissioner, I once in the European Parliament said, something like, are these animal welfare standards really necessary if we want to trade more with developing countries? I hinted at this thought. I was booed immediately. So from that moment, I understood I'd better not step into that ground. So nobody is going to govern trade, to develop trade in a way that diminishes this sort of protection. What matters if I'm an Ethiopian exporter of roses, what matters for me is that, if possible, EU, Japan, and US use the same standard. Because the obstacle to trade is not the standard. The obstacle to trade for me is the discrepancies between the standards. It's a different level. The certification process is different. If I'm to be certified by USDA, it will cost me, what, $80,000 a year, which, if I'm a small producer of roses, although the market is a great one, that's a bit of money I have to spend. And by the way, the machine which is used to detect the proper level has a tolerance level which is different in Europe, US, which means that even if they have the same standard, the fact that the tolerance of the machine is different is a problem for me. So that's the real issue. So I think these sort of big public policy which have to do with social standards, with environmental standards, again, I mention animal welfare because this is an area where views still slightly differ between, let's say, Bangladesh and Canada. For how long, I don't know. I remember when I was this of WTO, we nearly got into a big problem between Australia and Indonesia because Australia is exporting live cattle to Indonesia, but animal welfare activists in Australia started shouting that the way these cows were killed halal in Indonesia was an insult to animal well-being. happily, this case didn't happen. But they had last year a litigation in WTO because EU had banned baby seal meat and fur from Canada and Norway. And the European Parliament voted this ban because European parliamentarians hate this picture of baby seals killed, bleeding on this huge, nice, white piece of ice and snow. It's terrible. Now, the other side of the coin is that Canadians and Norwegians said, well, you know, the Inuits have been doing that for ages. They know how to do that, and that's their living. And if you ban trading their furs or meat, they'll have to go to another occupation which probably doesn't really fit with what the kind of life they want to live. Now, this landed on the WTO dispute settlement. And by the way, they probably on both sides spent, in terms of lawyer's fee, 50 times the whole amount of trade in baby and seal fur between Canada or Norway and Europe. So these things are going to come. And this is where, you know, the issue of dealing with these new obstacles become politically so important, because you cannot run this sort of negotiation or this sort of discussion. I shouldn't call it negotiation, because the moment you give the impression that you are negotiating precaution, you're dead. If you're a politician, the moment you give the impression that Europe is going to trade the safety of cars the American way against the safety of toys the European way, you're dead. It never happened this way. So this creates a new forum for the relationship between what people care about and trade. And I think, again, this needs to be carefully taken into account by public policy makers.
Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. My name is Tim Buter. I'm in the Political Science Department, Anti and Public Policy at Duke. We have a lot of evidence by now that in recent years, the benefits of an open international trading system have been increasingly broadly shared, which generally is considered a very good thing and has enlarged the political support globally for a free trade system. But within advanced industrialized countries, we've also had a lot of debate and increasingly strong data, quite starkly in the United States, suggesting that within these countries, the benefits of that open trading system and generally the benefits of economic growth in recent years and in recent decades even have been very narrowly concentrated and not very broadly shared, to the point that many people worry that that is reducing, sort of pulling out from under that open trading system the political support in the richest, most advanced countries. I wanted to ask you to reflect, if you would, on whether thinking of global trade in global value chains terms eases or exacerbates that political tension and problem.
No, I think it's a fundamental question because this normal interrogation we have, whether the way trade happens and the way we can harness, govern, regulate trade, at the end of the day, transforms into welfare is a permanent question, which, by the way, you know, trade economists of the 18th, 19th century have written a lot about. Now, in my view, and to put it probably too simply because this is a very complex debate, you know, trade and global value chains help us understanding this is very much a transmission belt of technological change. That's how it works. So the problem is not trade. The problem is technology. And you know, you're back to this Luddite question, which was the big separation in the sort of nascent trade union movement between those who say we have to break these machines because they suppress jobs, and others who say we've got to create the necessary political relationship with industry and owners of capital so that we convince them that it's not in their interest to do this way or that way. And basically, we are globally faced with the same sort of industrial / social problems as it happened in the 18th and the 19th century. My second answer is a large part of the problem of distribution of that has to do with domestic systems. So, depending on the quality of your welfare system, depending on the structure of your tax system, depending on your education system, whether it favors social mobility or not, depending on your regional system, it can give extremely different results, the difference being explained mostly by domestic differences rather than the phenomenon itself. And lastly, because I think we all always should try and have a sort of operational view of this, even if we need the sort of proper sort of mental approach, what is the alternative? Assuming that's true, that these new modalities of the expansion of market capitalism are creating not a transitory situation, because it may be the case, like inequalities with capital accumulation, for instance, if it becomes a sort of permanent feature, is there a policy response which would have to do with trade, which can address this problem? And to this, my answer is, I don't think so. If that is true, the solution, the sort of policy solutions to that are not in the trade field. They are in other ways. Societies work with their human capital.
So we're beginning to run short on time, so what I propose is, I see 3 people in the queue. If each of you would ask the question, and then we'll give Pascal the opportunity to respond to all 3 at once.
Thank you very much. My name is Anders Ero, International Trade Center in Geneva. I'll do it short because it was linked to the one that the lady asked before on NTMs. As you pointed to, it's not about doing away with them because they are there for a reason of public health, animal welfare, environmental protection, and so on. And yet we sometimes see that these measures discreetly are being used as a part of a protectionist by, for instance, increasing the regulation beyond what is reasonable to fulfill that measure, or having procedural obstacles introduced that makes it a bit difficult to actually adhere to that measure. Do you see NTMs increasingly being used as a way of protectionism, or do you see it's actually going the other way as what you pointed to as an alignment among standard settings, public standard settings to make trade easier?
Stephanie Barrientos, University of Manchester. Under the old trade system, the message given to countries was that if they wanted to compete, they needed to relax labour regulation and have lower labour standards. Multinational companies, largely lead firms, were put under enormous pressure by civil society organisations and have introduced a lot of different private codes covering labour standards and environmental standards. But as things like Rana Plaza, which you mentioned, have shown, they don't always work. And we now have this plethora of standards. In the new trade regime, what is the role of the state in terms of trying to enhance standards, both social and environmental, in the future?
Hi, I'm Cornelia Staritz from the Austrian Foundation for Development Research, and I want to make a comment on Rafe's questions and your reply related to global value chains and neoliberal policies. And I think it's quite clear when we look in the context of value chains that imports and also liberal trade policy towards imports, and more importantly even trade facilitation, is crucial. But I would argue it's probably not enough. And I mean, we see the re-emergence of the debate on industrial policy in many countries, and also like that many successful countries have used interventionist industrial policy and combined this with a more strategic approach to trade policy. So not just liberalization, but strategic trade policy. And measures, for example, like selective export taxes, or some selective local procurement policies connected with upgrading programs or other requirements related to FDI have been successful in some countries. In others, they have also been unsuccessful. So my point is more, I just think it's important to go away from the distinction between total protectionism or a very liberal approach to trade policy, but ask more how a strategic trade policy can be connected to industrial policy and interventions at the sector and firm level, and what your opinion specifically regarding your experience in trade negotiations is on this debate and between trade and industrial policy.
So before you answer, I see that we have a question from above. I'm not sure if we have a camera or a mic up there.
There's a mic.
There's a mic, no camera. Yeah. All right. So
thank you for coming, Mr. Lamy. The question I have is about Russia. The events in Ukraine and the subsequent Russian aggression has led to a lot of instability, and the American and European response was to, enforce embargo, trade sanctions. I think, as Henry Kissinger has stated, sanctions are not an evidence of policy, but rather lack of policy. The sanctions have further isolated Putin, and he's getting more paranoid day by day. Could you please comment as to if you think the sanctions are going to be effective in? Yeah. Thank you.
On let's say precaution as opposed to protection, this question of whether the level of precaution is excessive or not is a very, very complex one. The normal correct answer is science-based. But we all know that in practice this is not enough, and that there is a sort of anthropological dimension to precaution which is not physical science. Because again, precaution is about nightmares, and nightmares are different according to people, and that's great, by the way. If we all would have the same dreams or nightmare, life would be terrible. And it depends very much on your tradition, your culture, your religion, if you have one. So this world of precaution cannot be a rational world. It's full of imagination. And by the way, in some sense, that's good news, because it gives sort of more space to people's mind and in my view, dignity. Now, hence the extreme difficulty of anything that looks like an alignment that, in theory, is good for trade. Because of economies of scale, because of leveling the... You can't level the playing field of dreams and nightmares. So you will have to adjust to that. I don't know exactly how, but the example of TTIP and the problems it has met, notably in Germany, for instance, is a good example of that. And the big mistake they did on both sides, whether the Commission or USTR on the US side, is to handle this as a classical rational trade negotiation in selling it to the public that they've made their calculation and this will bring 0.5% GNP more on both sides, which translates into this and this employment. If I'm a sort of German consumer and I'm told that I have to eat chlorinated poultry, the numbers which the European Commissioner gives on TV about 0.5% GNP, this is not relevant. But I'm not kidding. This is this new reality. So we cannot reason in this. Now, of course, the ITC, and ITC is doing a great job, for instance, with its database on private standards. which, by the way, says something. ITC, who's in the business of promoting exports of developing countries, has a database on private standards. It doesn't have a database on public standards. Because these guys know that doesn't matter. What matters is private standards. Now, then the question, given that we are in a situation today where I think in these areas private standards are more constraining than public standards, the question is, what will happen in the future in what you can align? Is it going to be private-driven? Are Tesco, Walmart, and Carrefour and Ahold going to sit around the table and say, look, guys, couldn't we have the same thing? Or do we still want to compete with each other with the notion that I'm greener than you are at some cost for me? So something like this could happen. Or, and I would have a strong preference for that, not least for legitimacy and transparency reasons, is, for instance, the WTO going to be given a mandate to monitor this regulatory convergence. Now, it's a very different thing from what WTO has been doing so far, because, I mean, WTO people, they are excellent, but they have no clue about how you parameter a crash test, or how to calculate the maximum pesticide residue, or how to legislate on data privacy, not to speak about prudential regulation in the insurance business. And that's the world of regulators. So for the moment, I think these two options are there. A clever lawyer could say that a careful reading of the SPS and the TBT agreement might lead to an interpretation that WTO should do that. A bit creative, but could be tried, in order to avoid a sort of a century of negotiations between trade diplomats, whether WTO should do that or not. So that's, I think, that's the alternative we have to look at. And again, it's also the answer to the question of whether states or firms are doing this in what I see, hopefully, as a transition. I still believe that, again, for legitimacy reasons, for transparency reasons, this should be done in a public way, and it's likely that if Walmart, Carrefour, and I will do this, it's not going to be done in a public way, so I have a strong preference for the public way. Although, again, and 8 years in WTO have, let's say, vaccinated me a bit on this. If I have to wait 30 years for 160 members to agree on the pesticide residue, better not wait. And that's something which matters. Now, on industrial policy, absolutely, I totally agree that, the frontier between trade policy, industrial policy, I often said when I was presenting my book last year to various audiences, and I was, what's the best trade policy? And my answer was always, the best trade policy is a proper education policy. At the end of the day, I think this is what really makes a difference. So the question is not whether it's trade policy. The question is whether the use of trade instruments can be conducive to getting these outcomes better than others. Now, if you take export taxes, you probably are more literate than I am in the literature about export taxes. But my intuition, and at least what I got from my experience, is that it's shooting in your foot in 90% of cases. Maybe I'm wrong, maybe it's 70%. I would be surprised if the proportion was different. So, trade instruments in these global value chain systems are becoming double-edged swords. Let's just take the example of Argentina and beef, and I won't expand on this too much. we know the result. So what I think matters is a proper policy in order to exploit, expand, consolidate your comparative advantage. And this has to do with a number of public policies, starting, by the way, with logistics. I mean, Annabelle Gonzalez was here yesterday. I happened to recruit her when I was DG of WTO, and she led the Ag division at the time, where we started this Made in the World. And when she became minister in Costa Rica, and I will simplify just to give you an example, she looked at how much money Costa Rica was spending in subsidizing production of food in order to substitute imports. And she got this amount of money, of how much it costed, and she looked at what it would give if this money was invested in the modernization of the airport, so that Hewlett-Packard would create jobs in Costa Rica. And the calculation was very rapidly made. The proper trade policy answer was to put the money in the upgrading of the airport. So that's what I think, that's how we should reason in terms of trade policy in the new world as opposed to the old world. Finally, on Russia, I'll give a lawyer's answer, which is the safe way. The lawyer's answer is that Europe hasn't imposed trade sanctions on Russia. Europe and US and a few others have imposed financial sanctions, not trade sanctions. They haven't hurt Russian exports. They've targeted the financial system in Russia, which needs a number of connections to work smoothly. They've connected the wealth of all the capacity of wealthy people in Russia to use various bank accounts outside Russia. All areas which are not regulated internationally, and certainly not by WTO. They have to do with investment, they have to do, and unless in doing this, Europe or Russia would have breached commitments in access to financial services markets, nothing to do with WTO. And I presume that EU and US, when they're conceived these sanctions, have been very careful not to breach any of the commitments they have taken. And I'm sure EU and US, when they took commitments in opening their services market, have taken them with a language that says, in case they need to do that, they can do it. So that's the... Now, is it working or not? I don't know, frankly speaking. I mean, my impression is that it is, but I don't accede now to these numbers. What Russia did in reaction was trade sanctions, pure trade sanctions. Usually, and they've been doing this for quite a time. They're not the only ones in the WTO to do it, usually using SPS or TBT requirements in order to put obstacles to trade. And we know that this will, at the end of the day, land on the table of the WTO dispute settlement. The Russians will probably bring European measures to there, the other way round, and that's, at the end of the day, where the adjudication will take place. Again, whether it works or not, I don't know. I mean, in history, there is one example among many examples of trade sanctions, one example that worked, I think, reasonably well, but it was not only trade sanctions, which was against apartheid South Africa. Some say that the case of Iran, which, by the way, is not mostly with trade sanctions, but also with financial and economic non-trade sanctions, is working. Some say, I don't know. So this has to be evaluated sort of against these benchmarks, which, as we all know, are difficult to judge, and I think it's a sort of thing which you only understand 20 or 30 years later.
Well, Pascal, thank you so much for a terrific talk and a very thoughtful conversation with us. I'm sure everyone will join me in thank you for a terrific evening. Thank you very much.